everybody. So you guys are complete rock stars because we've been here for a long time and you guys are still here. So thank you so much. So I will not try to hold you too long. So I am going to tell you a little bit about myself and in my slide. So I'm going to talk about a tale of two experiences in the juxtaposition between race and disability, presented by me. Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but I'm a teacher and a mom, so everything has to lead with a story to provide context. I'm going to tell you a story. So I have two kids, 2 out of my 5. Their names are Cordell and Emma. They both attended the same school. This was not in Columbus, disclosure. They were both in the same life skills class, and their experiences could not be further from opposite of each other. So backstory for Emma. We received her, she was in foster care. She had experienced a lot of neglect, abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and she was listed as nonverbal and autistic, but she can talk, so it's more like selective mutism. She talks when she feels like it. And because she struggles to articulate herself, she acts out aggressively. So that could look like her hurting herself, hurting somebody around her, grabbing, hitting, biting, choking. I'm sure if you're a provider, a parent in the room, you understand. So a lot of those things fully documented, but that's kind of her story. Cordell was born as a micro preemie. He was born at 24 weeks. He weighed 1 pound, spent a long time in the NICU. He was fortunate enough that his story is a little different than Emma's. He had both of his parents at home. I was able to stay home with him, and he was able to participate in a lot of therapies throughout the years. He is completely nonverbal. But overall, he's a pretty happy kid. As long as he has his device, he's pretty good to go. So that story is important because I'm going to tell you 2 instances that happened at their school. So Emma was on the bus one day. She's on a life skills bus, and they were just taking too long to get her off the bus. Like, they were just walking a little too slow for her liking. So she reached out and she grabbed a teacher and she bit the teacher in the arm. She broke the skin. They called me. I'm at school and I was distraught. I said, "I'm so sorry. I just knew I was going to have to pick her up." They reassured me that she was safe, she was fine, they love her. She was just really overstimulated in the moment. Like, they kept articulating that she was just really overwhelmed. So she didn't have to go home. They gave her some snacks, they let her play on the iPad, and she went about her day. 2 weeks later, my son Cordell was on a slide in a life skills class. They're outside. And you know, when you're going down the slide, sometimes you get to the top of the slide and you just change your mind, right? So there was a little girl and she was just pondering her life on the top of the slide, and Cordell thought it would be good to help her get to the bottom of the slide. So he pushed her down the slide and she was not feeling him in that moment. So she began to cry and it was a whole thing. I get a call from the school and they say, "You have to come pick up Cordell right away. He assaulted another student. He's being suspended." And they explain that he's now a safety risk and we have to do some safety planning because the other children don't feel safe around him. So it kind of caught me off guard a little bit. So I thought about it and we had further conversation. And the reason that story is important is because they are the same age. Well, they're almost 1 year apart. They live in the same home. They have the same set of parents in the same class. The only difference is that my daughter Emma is white and my son Cordell is black. Emma's adopted. So if you go to the next one. So that led me to, in my mom brain, I was like, I gotta figure this out. Like, am I crazy or are they crazy? Because one of us is crazy. So I need to really figure out, am I overreacting or is there more to this story? So I did some research. So what I feel like qualifies me on this topic is I'm a licensed teacher here for BCSC. I teach special education. I'm a former DCS caseworker. And I'm a home-based caseworker, so I am in your home. So we're doing visits, we're doing everything you can imagine. I'm in your homes. And I also was a foster and adoptive parent of many special needs kids. In addition to that, obviously I sit on the board of the ARC, so I feel like I get to always work with really cool experts in the field. And I have a nonprofit called Cordell and Friends, where we work with minority families with children with disabilities. You can go to the next one. Okay, but by far, I think the most important qualification I have is me as a mom. I have 5 little ones. Obviously my girls are adopted. And 3 of my kids have a disability. 4 technically, if you count Connor, he has ADHD. So we are a big mixture of a lot of things in our household. And I would say, out of everything I've learned in college, everything I've read in a book, I feel like there's nothing that qualifies me more than being a parent or a caregiver of a person that lives it every single day. I feel like they should give us honorary PhDs at this point. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so it's interesting because when I talk about my experience and I talk about my son Cordell and Emma and just the differences that exist, people are very surprised. I don't know if you guys were surprised, but people are very surprised. And people are surprised because they assume that, they'll say like, disability doesn't see color, right? And they're just so surprised that these things even exist in a world where people already have challenges. So on top of those challenges, to bring race into it is something that is very surprising to people. But I think what we're failing to realize is we think that we see very black and white, either disability or not disability, but what we actually see is that we still live in a world where we see color. And most times, sometimes not, but most times, you'll see color before you see disability, right? At least in my son's case, you'll see that his color before you won't see him and know that he's nonverbal. You might hear him, he's quite loud if you're coming later, but you won't know that he has a disability, but you will know that he is black. So we'll go to the next one. Okay, so I'm talking to room providers, and I know I speak from a perspective of a parent, also a teacher, and a community member, but I think it is important to understand what the data says. And this is a quick Google search, so feel free to just Google. But one of the things I found interesting that it talks about how black people with disabilities, they encounter significant barriers in healthcare, education, employment, and access to public spaces. Black people with disability are also disproportionately incarcerated and experience higher rates of poverty than other racial groups and are at higher risk of violence and abuse. You can go to the next one. And this one, I'm gonna read the stats and I have another quick story time. So this one talks about how a diagnosis of ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, a conduct disorder, is likely overly diagnosed in black and non-white Hispanic children, particularly black boys. Oftentimes a white child with a similar presentation is more likely to be diagnosed with an adjustment disorder or ADHD. So back to the story time. So Connor, my little one, those of you who have met my little one, he is a squirmy little kid. He is very squirmy. I think he was born that way. And so when he started preschool, it was very hard for him to be still. Circle time just did not work for him. This concept of being quiet did not work for him. He was very impulsive. He could not understand that all four legs of the chair should stay on the ground. Like, those are all things that he struggled with. And the school was great, and they asked if I would be open for an evaluation. They didn't know I was a teacher. Of course I'm open to an evaluation, because who doesn't love another evaluation? And at the end of the evaluation, they stated that in order to provide services, they did need to establish a diagnosis. And I said, okay. And they said the diagnosis that we have agreed to, does anybody want to guess what it is? ODD. And I said, And I appreciate the last one because instead of being furious, I was kind of curious. So I said, I just have some questions. And I asked, it seems like a lot of the things that you're communicating to me describe ADHD. Hyperactive, he can't sit still, he's very impulsive, inattentiveness. And the lady agreed. And I said, so can you explain why he has to have a conduct disorder? She said, we can change it. She said, that was just what we discussed in our staffing. Understood. He has ADHD now. So let's go to the next one. And so the thing that I think is important when we're having these conversations, and I'm very grateful to have this conversation because these conversations are never easy. They're not easy for me standing here talking to you, and sometimes they're not easy for the receiver because sometimes the conversations just feel so heavy, and they feel like you're left feeling like you did something wrong, even though you didn't do anything wrong, or that you've been blamed for something that you have nothing to do with. So they feel heavy on both sides. So I think it's important when we have these conversations to give something tangible, like what can each of us do in this room to try to help counter the problem, once we can acknowledge that a problem does exist. So the first thing I would say is just to understand that words matter, right? So like I explained, how they describe my daughter, often both of my Caucasian daughters, they describe them as And Emma will bite the mess out of you, right? Like, she bites very hard sometimes, but they have never written in her IEP that she's aggressive. They've never talked about her being violent. They do say that she's overstimulated. They say that she's overwhelmed. They'll say she just is anxious. They use the word anxious a lot. And they say when she gets anxious, things trigger her. My son Cordell has cerebral palsy, and his mouth is naturally open. So when he is calm, drool is just flowing. And so they have even documented that is an act of refusal and an act of aggression. They say that he intentionally wants to get fluids on other people in the classroom. And so those are the things that I'm always asking, I'm curious about, right? Because my son has no history of aggressive behaviors. So why do we use those words like aggressive, angry, intentional, violent? And I think part of it is because there is an implicit bias. Implicit means not on purpose, right? So I think that goes into number 2. So knowing your bias and knowing your privilege. And I know bias is like target word, people don't like that word. But I think it's important to know that we all have them. Even me standing here, we all have them. So we can all exhale, we all have them, it's totally fine. I think it's just knowing that we have them. So I use myself as an example. One of my biases is that when I walk into a room or a classroom, I'm very aware of other minorities in the space. I'm very aware. So I can walk into any room and immediately I can say, okay, there's a Latino student, there's an Asian student, there's a Black student, there's a child with a disability, maybe there's a transgender student. Like I can just, and I'm very aware to make sure that those kids see me, right? And that's great. However, it's also important to understand that I think like that so that I can make sure that when I'm walking over to greet little Susie in the corner in her wheelchair, I also make sure that I stop and greet every single person on my way to Susie. That requires intentionality because it's not natural, right? It's not a natural, like my eyes go straight to Susie and I'm like, no one's probably even talked to Susie today. Like she's just been sitting over there and they probably don't pay her any attention. Like I'm gonna go over here and give Susie all the love, right? But I need to be intentional so that I show up the same way for every single person that I interact with. So that's why it's important to know your bias and important to know your privilege. It's a privilege for me that I can speak. My son is nonverbal. He can never articulate his wants and needs. I mean, he's loud and he has different octaves to the loudness, but he cannot articulate in a way that can help himself. That is a privilege that I have. I speak English. That is a huge privilege that I have in knowing how to navigate the space. So once you know what your privileges are, you can be intentional with helping people who don't have that same level of privilege. And the last one is when you see and hear something, speak up. And I know that it can be scary, and I know that it can be just really like awkward, like things just got really awkward in the lunchroom. But when you don't speak up, then silently you co-sign whatever that negative stereotype that's being discussed about. Just because you don't say anything, because most times we get awkward and we just don't say anything. Inside we're like, I don't really agree, but we don't say anything. The problem though is by not saying anything, the person thinks that you're in agreement with what they're doing. So I think it's so important that when you see something, hear something, speak up. And the last one, because of course we cannot have a slideshow without Cordell. So this is Cordell. And my nonprofit is Cordell and Friends, and the concept of it was working with other minority families that have children with disabilities who may have also felt like they don't have that outlet and that support system. Our motto is we're different is the new normal. And I love it because I'm always telling my students, like everybody in here is different. I don't know if you knew that or not. And I said, whether it's your eye color, your hair color, you guys talk different, sometimes you guys smell different, you eat different things, you listen to different music. So everybody in here is so different. So actually being different is pretty normal when you think about it. And then the kids are like, all right, Ms. Gaines. But the one thing I close with all the time is my motto, I guess I live by, is I won't ever change Cordell to fit into the world, but I will change the world to fit into people like him. Because I always tell people like, he's not the problem. We're the problem, right? Like he's probably the most open-minded, non-judgmental, nicest person you could ever meet. Like he's good. We're the ones that have all of these thoughts and these biases and these things that we think of how the world should work and who should fit in the world. So it's not him, it's us. So thank you guys for listening to my TED Talk. And I'll see some of you guys later on today. So thank you.